The dusty storage facility on Highway 287 outside Fort Worth had seen better days, its rows of orange roll-up doors baking under the Texas sun like coffins waiting to be opened. Jake Rodriguez gunned his Harley past the chain-link fence, his Bandidos patch catching the afternoon light. He'd won this unit in a blind auction for $300, pocket change from his last run, figuring he'd find furniture or tools to sell. Nothing prepared him for what waited inside Unit 47. Steele had earned his road name through 15 years of violence and loyalty to the club. He'd done things that would haunt most men forever. But when that rusty door rolled up and revealed walls covered in missing children's faces, his blood turned to ice. Dozens of photos, newspaper clippings, a child's pink backpack in the corner. And there, in the center of it all, a faded school picture that made his knees buckle. His little sister, Maria, missing since she was 8, since the day that changed everything. Jake stumbled backward, his leather boots scraping against the concrete. The oppressive Texas heat suddenly felt like winter in his bones. 20 years. 20 fucking years since Maria vanished from their grandmother's backyard while he was supposed to be watching her. He'd been 14, more interested in smoking stolen cigarettes behind the shed than keeping an eye on his baby sister. The guilt had driven him to the streets, to the violence, to the brotherhood of the Bandidos where pain could be channeled into purpose. But seeing her face again, that gap-toothed smile, those dark eyes full of trust, brought it all crashing back. He forced himself to step inside the unit, his hands trembling as he pulled out his phone's flashlight. The beam swept across the makeshift shrine, revealing a level of obsession that made his skin crawl. Every photo was laminated, every newspaper clipping carefully preserved. Red string connected various images like some demented detective's investigation board. Maria's photo sat in the center, but she wasn't alone. Jake counted at least 30 other children, their faces arranged in what appeared to be chronological order. Some he recognized from old news reports, cases that had gone cold, families that had never found answers. The earliest photos looked like they were from the 80s, yellowed and faded. The most recent couldn't be more than a few years old. A metal folding table held neat stacks of documents. Jake rifled through them with shaking hands, finding detailed notes about each child's disappearance. Times, locations, weather conditions, family situations, all meticulously recorded in the same cramped handwriting. The level of detail was staggering and terrifying. When he reached Maria's file, his vision blurred. The notes were extensive, spanning multiple pages. The writer knew things that had never been released to the public. What she'd been wearing that day, the exact time she'd disappeared, even details about the family dynamics that only someone close to the situation would know. But it was the final entry that stopped his heart. Subject relocated to secondary location. Experiment concluded. Disposal unnecessary. Natural causes. Jake's phone clattered to the floor as rage exploded through his chest. Maria hadn't just been taken. She'd been used for something, experimented on like a lab rat. And whoever wrote these notes spoke about her death with the clinical detachment of someone discussing the weather. He forced himself to keep reading. Other files contained similar language, subjects, experiments, disposal methods. This wasn't the work of a single predator. This was organized, systematic, spanning decades. The clinical terminology suggested medical or scientific training. A noise outside made him freeze. Footsteps on gravel, slow and deliberate. Jake killed his phone's flashlight and drew the Glock from his waistband, pressing himself against the unit's wall. Through the gap under the roll-up door, he could see shadow blocking the afternoon light. The footsteps stopped directly in front of Unit 47. Jake held his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs. Whoever was out there knew he was inside. Had they been watching him? Waiting for someone to discover their sick collection? A voice drifted through the door, elderly and refined, completely at odds with the horror surrounding Jake. I wondered when someone would finally open that unit. The rent payment stopped coming 6 months ago. Jake stayed silent, his finger hovering over the trigger. You found something interesting in there, didn't you? I saw your reaction when the door opened. Very telling. The voice moved closer to the door. I knew Dr. Henley well, you see. We had similar interests. He was quite disappointed when his funding was cut. Had to abandon his research rather abruptly. Dr. Henley. Finally, a name. He always said someone would eventually piece it together. Smart man, though perhaps not smart enough to cover his tracks properly. The footsteps began moving away. Enjoy your treasure hunt, Mr. Rodriguez, but be careful who you share your discoveries with. Some secrets are meant to stay buried. Jake waited until the sounds faded completely before allowing himself to breathe again. Whoever that was knew his name, knew about the storage unit's contents, and had just given him his first real lead in 20 years. Dr. Henley. The metallic taste of adrenaline flooded Jake's mouth as he stared at the wall of missing children. His hands trembled, a weakness he hadn't felt since his first kill, as he reached toward a faded newspaper clipping yellowed with age. The headline read, "Local girl vanishes without trace," above a photo that made his knees buckle. Maria, 7 years old, gap-toothed smile, wearing the purple butterfly shirt he'd helped her pick out at Walmart the week before she disappeared. 20 years collapsed into nothing. He was 12 again, watching his mother sob into Detective Morrison's handkerchief while his father paced the living room like a caged animal. The guilt crashed over him fresh. He should have walked her to school that morning, should have ignored his friends calling him a mama's boy, should have protected his little sister. Jake's breathing came in short bursts as he examined the shrine more closely. Maria's section took up nearly a quarter of the wall. Dozens of photos showed her at different ages, school pictures he recognized, but others he'd never seen. Maria at a playground he didn't recognize. Maria getting ice cream from a truck that never came to their neighborhood. Maria sitting in what looked like someone's backyard, her smile forced and her eyes wrong somehow. "What the fuck?" he whispered, his voice echoing in the cramped unit. Below the photos sat a plastic bin filled with items that made his stomach lurch. A purple hair ribbon he remembered her wearing. A small silver cross necklace. The one she'd gotten for her first communion, just months before she vanished. And things that were wrong, things that didn't belong. An adult woman's driver's license with Maria's face, but showing her as 27 years old, dated just 3 years ago. The license listed an address in Phoenix. Jake's mind reeled. Either someone had created an elaborate fake, or his sister hadn't died as a child. The implications clawed at him. If Maria was alive, where had she been for 20 years? Why hadn't she come home? And who the hell had been watching her closely enough to compile this obsessive collection? He pulled out his phone to call Reaper, then stopped. The club had strict rules about involving outsiders in their business, but this wasn't club business. This was family. This was the wound that had never healed, the reason he'd joined the Bandidos in the first place, searching for the kind of brotherhood he'd failed to provide his sister. Instead, he photographed everything, every newspaper clipping, every photo, every item in the bin. His hands steadied as he worked methodically through the documentation. Years of criminal activity had taught him the value of evidence, even when he didn't understand what it meant. The other children's sections were equally disturbing. Timothy Chen, age 9 when he disappeared from Sacramento in 2003. Lucy Hoffman, 6, vanished from a shopping mall in Fresno in 1998. At least 30 children total, their photos arranged with the same obsessive care as Maria's. Each had their own collection of personal items, their own progression of photos, showing them at different ages. Some sections ended abruptly, final photos showing children who looked sick or scared, their eyes hollow. Others, like Maria's, continued into adulthood with driver's licenses, what looked like surveillance photos, and handwritten notes in margins. Jake found a manila folder wedged behind one of the bins. Inside were maps of California, Arizona, and Nevada, marked with red pins, each labeled with initials and dates. Mr. 1999 marked their old neighborhood in San Bernardino. Phoenix had 5 different pins, the most recent marked Mr. 2021. There were also medical records, or what looked like medical records, psychological evaluations, medication lists, therapy session notes, all bearing Maria's name but with details that made no sense. References to conditioning protocols and subject compliance rates. Language that sounded more like animal training than mental health treatment. At the bottom of the folder, he found business cards. Dr. Edmund Voss, Child Psychology Services. The address listed was in Las Vegas, but someone had crossed it out and written Phoenix in the margin. Another card for something called Desert Haven Children's Research Institute, also in Phoenix. Jake's phone buzzed. Text from Reaper. Church meeting moved to 7. Don't be late. He checked the time. 6:15. He'd been in the storage unit for over 3 hours without realizing it. The meeting would have to wait. Everything would have to wait. 20 years of believing his sister was dead. 20 years of carrying that guilt. And now this evidence suggesting she might be alive, but trapped in something worse than death. He carefully returned everything to its original position, except for the manila folder, which he tucked inside his leather jacket. Tomorrow, he'd drive to Phoenix. Tonight, he needed to figure out how to find someone who didn't want to be found, and how to do it without getting himself or Maria killed in the process. The storage unit felt different now, not like a tomb, but like a doorway to hell. The photos scattered across Jake's kitchen table like broken glass, each one cutting deeper than the last. 23 children's faces stared back at him in the harsh fluorescent light, their school portraits and family snapshots creating a gallery of the lost. He'd been sitting here for 3 hours, chain-smoking Marlboros and trying to make sense of what he'd dragged out of that storage unit. His hands shook as he picked up the newspaper clipping about Sophia again. The headline hadn't changed. Local girl, 8, still missing after 2 weeks. The black and white photo showed his sister's gap-toothed smile, the same one that used to light up their cramped apartment when she'd greet him after school. The article mentioned details he'd forgotten, or maybe blocked out. How she'd been wearing her favorite purple backpack, how she'd stopped at Mrs. Chen's corner store to buy candy with her allowance before vanishing somewhere between there and home. Jake stubbed out his cigarette and reached for the evidence bag containing Sophia's hair ribbon. The plastic crinkled as he held it up to the light. Purple satin, just like she used to wear. His mother had bought her a whole pack of them from the dollar store, but purple was her favorite. She'd worn one exactly like this the last time he saw her. The problem was, this ribbon looked too clean, too preserved. After 20 years, it should have been faded, deteriorated. This one still held its shine, as if it had been carefully maintained, protected, treasured. His phone buzzed against the wooden table. The display showed Prospect. Mike and Jake debated ignoring it. The club would want to know where he'd been all day, why he'd missed the mandatory meeting at the clubhouse. But the Bandidos felt like another world right now, separated from this kitchen by 20 years of buried grief. "Yeah," he answered. "Steele, where the hell are you? Santos is pissed. Says you were supposed to be here for the Henderson thing." Jake rubbed his forehead. The Henderson thing, collecting protection money from the auto shop owner who'd been late on his payments. It seemed impossibly trivial now. "Tell Santos I'm dealing with family business." "Family business? Man, your family's been dead for—" Jake hung up and turned off the phone. Mike was right, in his blunt way. Jake's parents had died in a car crash 10 years ago, taking whatever secrets they might have held about Sophia's case with them. His extended family had scattered to the winds, unable to bear the weight of an unsolved tragedy. He was alone with this mystery, just like he'd been alone with his grief for 2 decades. He turned his attention to the other items from the storage unit. The manila folders contained police reports, witness statements, and investigative notes that went far beyond what any grieving family member should have possessed. Whoever had compiled this collection had either been law enforcement themselves or had access to someone who was. The level of detail was staggering. Crime scene photos, forensic reports, interview transcripts with suspects who'd never been publicly identified. One name appeared repeatedly in the margins, written in the same careful handwriting: Detective Raymond Walsh. Jake recognized the name vaguely from the original investigation into Sophia's disappearance. Walsh had been the lead detective, a 20-year veteran who'd handled most of the missing children cases in their precinct during the late 90s and early 2000s. Jake flipped through more files, noting the dates. The cases spanned nearly 15 years, from 1995 to 2009. All children between the ages of 6 and 12. All from lower-income neighborhoods where parents worked multiple jobs and kids often walked home alone. All cases that had gone cold with minimal media attention. The realization hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't the work of multiple kidnappers or random predators. The similarities were too precise, the geographic pattern too deliberate. Someone had been hunting these children systematically, selecting victims who fit a specific profile. Children like Sophia, whose disappearances wouldn't generate sustained public pressure or extensive resources. But if Detective Walsh had identified this pattern, why hadn't it been made public? Why hadn't there been task forces or FBI involvement? Jake pulled out his laptop and ran a quick search for Raymond Walsh. The results made his blood run cold. "Retired detective found dead in apparent suicide," read the headline from 3 years ago. The brief article mentioned Walsh's long career and his struggle with depression following his retirement. It noted that he'd been found in his home garage, dead from carbon monoxide poisoning. The investigation had been brief. The case closed quickly. Jake stared at the screen, his mind racing. A detective discovers evidence of a serial killer targeting children and then dies under suspicious circumstances before the information can go public. The same detective whose private investigation materials end up in a storage unit, abandoned and forgotten until a biker with a personal connection stumbles across them. This wasn't coincidence. This was someone's insurance policy. A dead man's switch that had finally been triggered. Walsh had known he was in danger, and he'd hidden the evidence where it might eventually be found. The question now was whether Jake was walking into the same trap that had killed Detective Walsh. The Bandidos clubhouse reeked of stale beer and motor oil, but Jake barely noticed as he spread the contents of the storage unit across the bar's scarred wooden surface. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows that made the photographs look even more haunting. It was past midnight, and the place was empty except for the occasional rumble of a Harley pulling into the lot outside. Jake's hands trembled slightly as he arranged the items in chronological order. Each missing child represented someone's worst nightmare, and seeing them laid out like this made his stomach churn. The oldest newspaper clipping dated back to 1987, the newest to just 3 years ago. Whoever had collected these had been at it for decades. He found himself staring at a photograph of a little girl with pigtails, maybe 7 years old, clutching a stuffed elephant. The resemblance to Maria was subtle but unmistakable, the same dark eyes, the same stubborn set to her jaw. His sister had been 8 when she vanished, just 1 year older than this girl. The sound of heavy boots on gravel made Jake quickly gather the photos into a pile. The clubhouse door swung open, and Tommy Diesel Martinez walked in, his prospect patch gleaming under the lights. Tommy was young, maybe 25, eager to prove himself worthy of full membership. "Steele, man, what are you doing here so late?" Tommy approached the bar, squinting at the scattered papers. "Thought you were flipping some storage unit crap." Jake's first instinct was to hide everything, but something about Tommy's expression stopped him. The kid had grown up in the same neighborhood as Jake, had seen his share of disappeared friends and family members who simply vanished into the city's underbelly. "Found something weird," Jake said, his voice rougher than usual. "Real weird." Tommy leaned closer, and Jake watched his face change as he took in the photographs and newspaper clippings. The younger man's eyes widened, then hardened. "Jesus Christ, Steele, what the hell is this?" "Someone's been collecting these. Missing kids from all over Texas, going back 30 years. Jake pulled out the photo that had caught his attention earlier. "This one, she looks like Maria." Tommy knew the story. Everyone in the club knew about Jake's sister, though nobody talked about it. It was one of those wounds that never healed, the kind that turned a man into what Jake had become. Hard, angry, always ready for a fight. "You think there's a connection?" Tommy asked, settling onto a bar stool. Jake shrugged, but his jaw was tight. "Don't know yet. But whoever put this collection together, they weren't doing it for fun. Look at this." He pulled out a manila folder he hadn't opened yet, one that had been wedged between two photo albums. Inside were handwritten notes, pages and pages of them. Names, dates, locations where children had last been seen, cross-references between cases, maps with red circles marking disappearance sites. It looked like someone's private investigation, obsessively detailed and spanning years. "This is some serial killer shit," Tommy whispered, reading over Jake's shoulder. "Or someone trying to catch one." Jake flipped through the pages, his heart pounding. Halfway through the folder, he found what he'd been dreading and hoping for: Maria's name, written in the same careful handwriting as all the others. Maria Elena Rodriguez, age 8, disappeared June 15, 2003. Last seen walking home from school on Maple Street. Below that, someone had written, "Possible connection to Hartley and Simmons cases. Same MO, same geographical area." Jake's vision blurred for a moment. 20 years of buried grief threatened to overwhelm him, but he forced it down. He'd learned long ago that emotions were a luxury he couldn't afford. "Hartley and Simmons," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Find those files." Tommy rifled through the papers, while Jake stared at his sister's name. It seemed impossible that after all this time, after the police had given up and his family had fallen apart, some stranger had been investigating Maria's disappearance. "Here," Tommy said, pulling out 2 more files. "Jennifer Hartley, disappeared 2002. Michael Simmons, 2004. Both 8 years old, both from your old neighborhood." Jake opened Jennifer's file first, the little girl with pigtails and the stuffed elephant, the one who looked like Maria. According to the notes, she'd vanished on a Tuesday afternoon, walking home from an after-school program. Her body had never been found. Michael Simmons had disappeared from a playground 6 blocks from where Maria was last seen. Same pattern, broad daylight, no witnesses, no trace. "Someone was hunting kids in your neighborhood," Tommy said quietly, "and whoever owned this storage unit was tracking them." Jake closed the files, his mind racing. The question that had haunted him for 20 years, what happened to Maria, suddenly seemed answerable. But finding answers meant diving into a darkness he wasn't sure he was prepared for. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, promising a storm. The photographs spread across Jake's kitchen table like tarot cards, predicting a future he didn't want to see. 23 children, all between the ages of 8 and 12, all missing within a 100-mile radius over the past 3 decades. Maria's photo sat in the center, a gap-toothed smile frozen in time, surrounded by strangers who felt like family. Jake's hands trembled as he reached for his coffee, the ceramic mug clicking against his teeth. He'd been at this for 6 hours straight, cross-referencing dates, locations, physical descriptions. The pattern was there, subtle but undeniable. The ages, the time intervals, the geographical clustering around Interstate 35, it all pointed to something systematic, deliberate. His phone buzzed. Rico's name flashed on the screen. You missed church, Rico said without preamble. Sunday meant mandatory club meeting, and Jake hadn't missed one in 5 years. Had something come up? Yeah? Well, Diaz is asking questions. Says you've been acting strange since that storage unit thing. Jake rubbed his eyes, the photos blurring together. Tell Diaz I'm handling personal business. Brother, whatever's eating at you. I said I'm handling it. The line went quiet. Rico's breathing was audible, measured. You know where to find me when you're ready to talk. After Rico hung up, Jake stared at his phone's black screen, seeing his reflection distorted in the glass. The club had been his anchor for 15 years, the only family that mattered after Maria vanished and his parents retreated into their separate hells of grief and blame. But now, surrounded by evidence of something monstrous, the brotherhood felt distant, almost irrelevant. He turned back to the photos and noticed something he'd missed before. 3 of the children wore similar necklaces, thin silver chains with small pendants. Jake grabbed a magnifying glass from his junk drawer and leaned closer. The pendants were identical, tiny silver angels with outstretched wings. His blood turned to ice water. Maria had worn an identical necklace. Their grandmother had given it to her for her 8th birthday, just 2 months before she disappeared. Jake remembered how she'd touched it constantly, a nervous habit that drove him crazy when he was trying to watch TV. The room tilted. Jake gripped the table edge until his knuckles went white, fighting the urge to sweep everything to the floor. This wasn't coincidence. Someone had been hunting these children, marking them somehow, and Maria had been part of it. He needed more information about the necklaces, but the police files would be sealed, assuming they even existed. Most of these cases were decades old, relegated to cold case files or forgotten entirely. But there was another option, one that made his stomach clench. Elena Vasquez lived in the same neighborhood where Maria had disappeared, in a house that looked like it hadn't been painted since the Clinton administration. Jake sat in his truck outside her chain-link fence for 10 minutes, watching her tend to a garden that somehow thrived despite the cracked soil and urban decay surrounding it. Elena had been the last person to see Maria alive. She'd been hanging laundry when Maria walked past, heading toward the corner store that was only 3 blocks away but might as well have been on Mars for all the distance it represented in their lives. Jake forced himself out of the truck and up the cracked walkway. Elena looked up from her tomato plants, her weathered face creasing into a frown of recognition. Jake Rodriguez, she said, not getting up. Haven't seen you in this neighborhood for a long time. Mrs. Vasquez. He stopped at the garden's edge, unsure how to begin. I wanted to ask you about Maria. About that day. Her hands stilled on the vine she'd been examining. That was 20 years ago, mijo. Why now? Jake pulled out his phone and showed her Maria's photo from the storage unit collection. Elena's face went pale beneath her sun-darkened skin. Where did you get this? Someone was collecting pictures of missing children. Maria was part of it. He hesitated, then pressed forward. Do you remember the necklace she was wearing? The silver angel? Elena sat back on her heels, her gardening gloves dark with soil. See, she was always touching it. But Jake, she looked directly at him, her eyes sharp despite her age. She wasn't wearing it that day. What? The necklace. She wasn't wearing it when she walked past my house. I remember because I thought it was strange. She never took that thing off. But that morning, no necklace. Jake's mind raced. If Maria hadn't been wearing the necklace when she left the house, where had it gone? Had someone taken it from her earlier? Had she hidden it somewhere? Mrs. Vasquez, is there anything else you remember about that day? Anything at all? She stood slowly, brushing dirt from her knees. There was a car parked down the street. White sedan. I didn't think much of it then, but it was there when she walked past, and it was gone when I went back outside an hour later. The Riverside County Sheriff's Department looked like every other government building Jake had seen. Beige brick, fluorescent lights that hummed like dying insects, and the smell of burnt coffee mixing with industrial disinfectant. He'd been in plenty of police stations before, but never voluntarily, and never with a box of evidence that might solve a 20-year-old case. Detective Sarah Chen was younger than he'd expected, maybe mid-30s, with sharp eyes that took in his colors, his tattoos, the way he carried himself. She didn't flinch when he walked into her cramped office, which earned her a point in his book. "Mr. Rodriguez," she said, gesturing to a metal chair across from her desk. "I have to say, your call was unexpected." Jake set the box carefully on her desk, noting how her expression shifted when she saw the contents. Photos of missing children stared up at them both, and he watched her face harden into something professional but troubled. "Tell me about the storage unit," she said, pulling on latex gloves. He walked her through it. The auction, the locked room, what he'd found inside. She listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes, her pen scratching against yellow legal paper. When he got to the part about Maria's bracelet, her pen stopped moving. "You're certain it belonged to your sister?" "Dead certain. My grandmother gave it to her for her 8th birthday. Had her name engraved on the back." Jake's throat felt tight. Maria never took it off. Detective Chen carefully lifted the bracelet from the box, examining the small silver links, the tiny heart charm. She found the engraving on the back plate and nodded slowly. "Your sister's case," she said, turning to her computer. "I pulled the file after you called. Maria Elena Rodriguez, age 10, disappeared from Riverside Park on June 15, 2003. Last seen on the playground around 3 in the afternoon. They said she probably ran away." The old anger sparked in Jake's chest. 10 years old, and they said she ran away. The initial investigation was lacking. Chen's diplomatic tone didn't hide her disapproval. Different department, different procedures. But this changes things. She was already moving, photographing each item in the box, cataloging everything with the kind of methodical precision that made Jake think she might actually give a damn about finding answers. The storage unit was registered to whom? Some company called Clearwater Holdings. Paid up for 15 years, then stopped. That's when it went to auction. Chen typed rapidly, her screen reflecting blue light off her glasses. "Clearwater Holdings. Interesting. It's a shell company dissolved in 2019. But I can trace the corporate filings, see who was behind it." Jake watched her work, surprised by the efficiency. He'd expected bureaucracy, delays, maybe polite dismissal. Instead, Chen treated the box like it was evidence in an active case, not a cold file gathering dust. "Mr. Rodriguez, I need to ask, why bring this to me? Someone with your background might be tempted to handle this personally." The question hung between them like smoke. Jake understood what she was really asking. Why trust the system that had failed Maria 20 years ago? Why not take his bike, his colors, his brothers in the club, and find his own justice? "Because Maria deserves better than revenge," he said finally. "She deserves the truth." Chen studied his face for a long moment, then nodded. "Okay, I'm going to be straight with you. This case connects to something bigger. 3 of these children," she gestured to the photos, "disappeared from different counties over a span of 15 years. Different investigating agencies, no communication between departments. But if one person was collecting all this, you think it's serial. I think we're looking at someone who is very careful, very organized, and very patient." Chen pulled out a file folder, thick with papers. "I've been working missing children cases for 8 years. You start to see patterns, connections that other people miss. This storage unit might be the break we've needed." Jake felt something shift in his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced in years. Hope, maybe, or something close to it. For 2 decades, Maria's disappearance had been a wound that wouldn't heal, a question without an answer. Now, for the first time, there might be a path forward. What happens next? "I contact the other jurisdictions," Start coordinating. We process everything in this box for DNA, fingerprints, any trace evidence. And I need you to tell me everything you remember about the day Maria disappeared. Everything, no matter how small it seems. Chen handed him her business card, her contact information printed in plain black text. Mr. Rodriguez, I can't promise this will be easy. Cold cases are difficult, and 20 years is a long time. But I can promise you this. I won't let your sister's case get buried again. Jake pocketed the card and stood, leaving the box and its dark contents on her desk. Walking out of the station, he felt lighter somehow, as if sharing the burden had made it more bearable. The rain hammered against the garage windows as Jake spread Detective Carmen Silva's files across his workbench, the fluorescent light casting harsh shadows over crime scene photos and witness statements. Each document felt like a piece of broken glass, cutting deeper into wounds he'd thought had scarred over decades ago. Maria's file was thinner than the others, a testament to how quickly the investigation had gone cold. Missing person report filed by their mother 3 days after Maria vanished. Canvass of the neighborhood yielding nothing. A few witness statements from kids who'd seen her walking home from school, but nobody remembered anything after she'd turned onto Elm Street, just 2 blocks from their house. Jake's hands trembled as he picked up Maria's school photo, the same one their mother had clutched at every press conference, her voice breaking as she begged for information. 8 years old, gap-toothed smile, wearing the pink sweater she'd insisted on even though it was too warm for September. His phone buzzed. Tommy's name flashed on the screen. You better have a good reason for missing church. Tommy's voice carried that edge it got when club business was brewing. Family stuff, Jake said, not entirely lying. Family stuff doesn't pay the bills, brother. Reaper wants to see you. 1 hour. The line went dead. Jake stared at the phone, then at the files spread before him. The club had been his family for 15 years, the only constant in a life built on shifting ground. But sitting here, surrounded by evidence of horrors that made their criminal activities look like parking violations, he felt the familiar tug of loyalty warring with something else, something that felt like purpose. He gathered the files, locked them in his toolbox, and headed for his bike. The clubhouse sat on the outskirts of town, a converted warehouse surrounded by chain link and razor wire. Jake's Harley rumbled through the gate, past prospects washing bikes and patching bullet holes in the siding. Reminders of last month's territorial dispute with the Iron Wolves. Inside, smoke hung thick in the air. Brothers clustered around pool tables in the bar, their voices mixing with classic rock bleeding from ancient speakers. But the main room felt different today, charged with the kind of tension that preceded either celebration or bloodshed. Reaper sat at the head of the long wooden table, his presidential patch catching the light. 60 years old and harder than coffin nails, he'd built this chapter from nothing and ruled it with an iron fist wrapped in brotherhood. Steel. Reaper's voice could strip paint. Glad you could join us. Jake took his seat, nodding to the other officers. Tommy avoided his eyes, which meant whatever was coming wouldn't be pleasant. Got a problem? Reaper continued, sliding a newspaper across the table. The headline made Jake's blood freeze. Police investigate connection between storage unit discovery and cold cases. The article was vague, mentioning an ongoing investigation into items of interest found in a storage facility. But Jake recognized Detective Silva's carefully chosen words about following new leads in several missing persons cases. This storage unit they're talking about. Reaper's eyes never left Jake's face. Wouldn't happen to be the one you bought last week, would it? The room went quiet, except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of pool balls clicking. Jake felt every gaze in the room, measuring him, waiting for his response. Yeah, he said, it's mine, and you didn't think to mention you'd stumbled into a police investigation? Jake met Reaper's stare. Didn't know it was one. until after I'd already called it in. Called it in? Reaper's laugh held no humor. You called the cops on yourself. There were photos of missing kids in there. What was I supposed to do? You were supposed to handle it quiet. Reaper's voice rose. You were supposed to think about your brothers before you went playing good citizen. Around the table, faces hardened. Jake had seen that look before, usually right before someone got voted out in bad standing, or worse. The heat from this investigation lands on the club, Reaper continued, and that's on you. You understand that? Jake nodded, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying Detective Silver's words about the storage unit owner, Richard Volkov. The name meant nothing to him, but something about it nagged at the edges of his memory. So, here's what's going to happen. Reaper leaned forward. You're going to distance yourself from this mess. No more talking to cops. No more playing detective. You're going to let sleeping dogs lie and focus on club business. And if I don't, the question hung in the air like smoke. Reaper's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Then you'll find out what happens when family loyalty runs one direction. Jake stood slowly, every eye in the room tracking his movement. At the doorway, he turned back. Some things are more important than business. He walked out before anyone could respond, the weight of burned bridges settling on his shoulders like a familiar leather cut. The rain hammered against the warehouse windows as Jake spread the contents of the storage unit across the concrete floor. 3 days had passed since his confrontation with Marcus, and the pieces were finally starting to form a picture, one that made his blood run cold. Detective Sarah Chen crouched beside him, her latex gloves catching the harsh fluorescent light as she examined a manila folder. "This is meticulous," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Whoever did this kept trophies from at least 15 different cases." Jake's hands trembled as he held up a small plastic bag containing a red hair ribbon. The evidence tag read Maria Santos, age 7, disappeared June 15, 2019. He'd seen that name in the newspaper clippings, the little girl who vanished from a playground in broad daylight, while her mother talked to another parent just 50 feet away. "The bastard organized them by year," Jake growled, gesturing to the neat rows of boxes. "Look at this sick shit. He's got photos of the crime scenes, personal items, even—" His voice caught, "even locks of their hair." Sarah's jaw clenched as she opened another file. Inside were surveillance photos of children playing in parks, walking to school, getting off buses. The images had been taken with a telephoto lens from a distance, creating an intimate stalker's gallery. Red circles marked specific children, with handwritten notes in the margins detailing their routines, their families, their vulnerabilities. "Jake, look at this." Sarah held up a leather journal, its pages filled with cramped handwriting. "It's a diary. He documented everything, his methods, his selection process, where he kept them." Jake's stomach lurched. The clinical detachment in the writing was worse than any violent rant would have been. The killer wrote about the children like they were specimens in an experiment, noting their reactions to captivity, their pleas, their final moments, with the same dispassion he might use to describe the weather. "June 3rd, 2018, Sarah read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. The Matthews boy lasted longer than expected. His sister's items seemed to comfort him until the end. Note: family connections increase cooperation. The warehouse felt like it was closing in around them. Jake had seen violence, had dealt death with his own hands when necessary, but this methodical cruelty was something else entirely. This was evil in its purest form. "Here," Sarah said, pulling out a floor plan sketched on graph paper. "This looks like a building layout. Multiple rooms, basement levels. There are notes about soundproofing, ventilation systems." Jake studied the drawing, his mind racing. The structure looked familiar, but he couldn't place it. The killer had marked certain rooms with numbers, corresponding to entries in his journal. Room 3 was labeled Preparation. Room 5 was holding, and Room 7 simply said, disposal. Sarah continued flipping through the journal, her face growing paler with each page. Jesus Christ, Jake, this goes back decades. The earliest entry is from 1987. She paused, her finger tracking across the page. He talks about perfecting his craft, learning from mistakes. The early victims, he calls them practice runs. A photograph slipped from between the journal's pages and fluttered to the floor. Jake bent to retrieve it, and froze. The image showed a man in his 50s with thinning hair and wire-rimmed glasses, standing beside a white van. He was smiling at the camera, looking for all the world like someone's grandfather. But Jake recognized the background. It was the same warehouse district where Marcus had his operation. Son of a bitch, Jake breathed. This was taken recently. Look at the cars in the background. That's a 2020 Honda Civic. Sarah leaned closer. So our killer is still active. This isn't some cold case collection. He's still out there. Jake's phone buzzed. A text from Razor. Found something at Marcus's place. You need to see this. Now. They gathered the evidence quickly. Sarah calling for a forensics team to process the rest of the storage unit. As they loaded the most critical items into her unmarked police car, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The weight of 20 years of unanswered questions pressed down on him, but now those questions were taking a darker turn. What if Isabel isn't dead? He asked suddenly as they pulled out of the warehouse parking lot. What if this sick fuck kept her somewhere? What if she's been alive all this time? Sarah glanced at him, her expression carefully neutral. Jake, you have to prepare yourself for... No, his voice was steel. Don't tell me to prepare for anything. If there's even a chance she's alive, I'm going to find her. And when I find the bastard who took her, I'm going to make him wish he'd never been born. The rain continued to fall as they drove through the empty streets, the evidence of unspeakable crimes riding with them in the darkness. The rain hammered against the windshield as Jake sat in his Harley's saddle outside the Riverside County Sheriff's Department, water streaming down his leather jacket. 3 days had passed since his meeting with Detective Martinez, 3 days of waiting for a callback that never came. His patience had finally snapped. The fluorescent lights inside the station buzzed overhead as Jake approached the front desk, his boots squeaking against the polished linoleum. The desk sergeant, a heavy-set man with graying temples, looked up with barely concealed irritation. "I'm here to see Detective Martinez," Jake said, keeping his voice level despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. "She's in a meeting. You can wait or make an appointment." Jake's jaw tightened. "Tell her Jake Rodriguez is here. She'll want to see me." 20 minutes later, Martinez appeared, her expression unreadable. She led him through a maze of desks and filing cabinets to a small interview room that reeked of stale coffee and desperation. "You've been avoiding my calls," Jake said before she could sit down. Martinez closed the door and turned to face him. "I've been working your case, Mr. Rodriguez. These things take time." "Bullshit. You ran the DNA, didn't you? What did you find?" She hesitated, and in that moment of silence, Jake felt his world tilt. He'd spent 20 years wondering, hoping, grieving. Now the truth was sitting across from him in a woman who couldn't meet his eyes. "The hair sample from the storage unit," Martinez began, her voice carefully controlled. "It's not a match for your sister." The words hit him like a physical blow. Jake gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. "That's impossible. Maria's bracelet was there, her picture." The bracelet could have been planted. The photograph was from a newspaper clipping. "Mr. Rodriguez, I know this isn't what you wanted to hear." Jake stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "So, that's it? Case closed? My sister's still out there somewhere, and you're just going to—" "Your sister is dead." The words cut through the air like a blade. Martinez's face had hardened, her professional mask slipping to reveal something that looked almost like pity. "We found her remains 3 years ago. Construction crew was laying foundation for a strip mall about 40 miles east of here. Dental records confirmed it was Maria Rodriguez. "I'm sorry, Jake. I thought you knew." The room seemed to spin around him. Jake reached for the wall, his breathing shallow. 3 years ago? Why wasn't I notified? There was no next of kin listed. Your father had passed. Your mother was in a care facility with advanced dementia. The case was closed quietly. 20 years of searching, of hoping she might walk through his door someday. 20 years of carrying the weight of his failure to protect her. And she'd been dead all along, buried in an unmarked grave while he tore his life apart looking for ghosts. How? The word came out as barely a whisper. Martinez consulted her file. Blunt force trauma to the skull, consistent with the MO of several other victims from that time period. We believe she was killed shortly after her disappearance. Jake sank back into the chair, his head in his hands. The storage unit, the shrine, the carefully arranged photographs, none of it had been about saving Maria. Someone had been playing games with victims' families, collecting trophies from their pain. "The storage unit," he said, looking up. "Someone's been watching us. The families, collecting our grief like fucking souvenirs." Martinez nodded grimly. "We're looking into the rental history, trying to trace who's been paying for that unit. But the paperwork goes back 15 years, and there have been multiple shell companies involved." 15 years? Jake's voice was rough. "This bastard's been at it for 15 years? Maybe longer. We're cross-referencing with missing persons cases from neighboring counties. There could be dozens of families who've been targeted." Jake thought about the other photographs in the storage unit. The faces of children who would never come home. Somewhere out there, other families were living his nightmare, clinging to hope that was already dead. "I want to help," he said. "I want this sick fuck found." Martinez studied him for a long moment. "Mr. Rodriguez, I understand you're angry, but this is police business now. The best thing you can do is go home and let us handle it. Like you handled finding my sister." The detective's face flushed. "That's not fair, and you know it. We're doing everything we can." Jake stood and headed for the door. "No, detective. Everything you can do isn't nearly enough." Outside, the rain had stopped, but the sky remained grey and threatening. Jake climbed onto his bike, his hands shaking as he gripped the handlebars. Maria was gone, had been gone for 20 years, but whoever had been collecting pieces of his grief was still out there, still hunting, and Jake intended to find him first. The old warehouse smelled like rust and broken dreams. Jake killed the Harley's engine and let the silence settle around him, broken only by the distant hum of interstate traffic. Marcus had given him the address over the phone, voice tight with something Jake couldn't quite name, fear maybe, or the kind of exhaustion that came from carrying secrets too long. The building squatted in an industrial district that time had forgotten, surrounded by chain link and weeds. Jake counted 3 other bikes already parked outside, their chrome dulled by the overcast sky. He recognized Tommy's Sportster and Big Jim's Road King, but the third machine was unfamiliar, a pristine black Electra Glide that looked like it had rolled off the showroom floor yesterday. Inside, footsteps echoed off concrete walls lined with empty shelves. Jake followed the sound deeper into the building, past offices with broken windows and doors hanging crooked on their hinges. The air grew colder as he walked, and something else crept in, the metallic taste of old blood and newer fear. He found them in what used to be the main warehouse floor. Marcus stood with his back to the entrance, shoulders rigid beneath his leather cut. Tommy and Big Jim flanked him like sentries, their usual easy camaraderie replaced by something harder. And sitting on a folding chair in the center of the space was a man Jake had hoped never to see again. Vincent the surgeon Castellano looked exactly the same as he had 5 years ago. Pale skin stretched tight over sharp bones, silver hair combed back in perfect lines, and eyes the color of winter ice. He wore an expensive suit that probably cost more than most people's cars, and his hands rested calmly on his knees, as if this were a boardroom instead of an abandoned warehouse. "Jake," Castellano said, his voice carrying the faint trace of an accent that might have been Italian or might have been something else entirely. "You've grown up. Still playing dress-up with the motorcycle club, I see." "Vincent." Jake kept his voice level, professional. The last time they'd been in the same room, 3 men had died, and Jake had sworn he'd put that life behind him. "Didn't expect to see you back in town. Business calls." Castellano's smile revealed teeth like polished ivory. "I understand you've been asking questions about some old photographs, stirring up memories that some people would prefer to keep buried." Marcus finally turned around, and Jake saw the bruise spreading across his left cheek, dark purple against his weathered skin. His eyes held an apology and a warning in equal measure. "He knows about the storage unit," Marcus said. "Knows about Elena." The warehouse fell silent, except for the sound of Jake's heartbeat thundering in his ears. He'd been careful, had told only Marcus about what he'd found, which meant either his sergeant-at-arms had talked or Castellano had sources Jake hadn't considered. "Elena Rodriguez," Castellano continued, savoring each syllable like fine wine. "Beautiful little girl. Such a tragedy what happened to her. Though I suppose happened isn't quite the right word, is it? Implies something random, an act of God or cruel fate." Jake's hand moved instinctively toward the .45 tucked under his jacket, but Big Jim's warning look stopped him. They were outnumbered here, and Castellano hadn't survived 20 years in his business by walking into rooms without an exit strategy. "You killed her." The words came out flat, matter of fact. Jake had suspected it, had felt the truth crystallizing in his gut over the past few days, but hearing it said aloud made something cold and sharp settle in his chest. "I did a lot of things back then," Castellano replied. "Young man's mistakes, you might say. Sloppy work. If I'd been smarter, more careful, you never would have found that shrine. Poor Daniel Kowalski, such dedication to his guilt. 20 years he spent building that monument to his failures, collecting evidence of all the children he couldn't save, including Elena." Elena Castellano stood slowly, straightening his jacket with practiced precision. The old man was quite obsessed with her case, you know, kept digging even after the police gave up. He had theories about who might have been responsible, about why certain evidence disappeared from the investigation. Jake felt the weight of the photographs in his jacket pocket, the images he'd taken from Kowalski's shrine, Elena's school picture, the newspaper clipping about her disappearance, the small silver bracelet that their grandmother had given her for her 8th birthday. He was getting close, Jake said. Uncomfortably close. Which is why Daniel had to have an accident. Such a shame. Old man slips on ice, hits his head, dies alone in his apartment. These things happen in Chicago winters. The admission hung between them like smoke. Marcus shifted his weight, hand drifting toward his own weapon, but Castellano seemed unconcerned by the threat. "The question now," Castellano continued, "is what happens next. You've opened a door that was meant to stay closed, Jake. The question is whether you're smart enough to walk back through it and pretend you never saw what was on the other side." The abandoned warehouse squatted like a cancer in the industrial district, its broken windows staring blindly at the oil-stained street. Jake cut the Harley's engine 2 blocks away, letting the silence settle around him like a shroud. The weight of his .45 pressed against his ribs as he studied the building through the chain-link fence. This was it. The address from Coleman's files, the place where the bastard had taken his pictures, where he'd brought the children. Jake's hands trembled as he pulled wire cutters from his jacket. 20 years of rage coursed through his veins, but underneath it lurked something worse. Fear. Fear of what he might find in there. Fear that he was too late, had always been too late. The fence parted with soft pings of severed wire. Jake slipped through, keeping low as he approached the loading dock. Gravel crunched under his boots despite his efforts to move quietly. The smell hit him first, decay and neglect, but something else. Something sweet and wrong that made his stomach lurch. The loading dock door hung open like a gaping mouth. Jake drew his weapon and clicked on the small flashlight he'd clipped to the barrel. The beam cut through absolute darkness, revealing a cavernous space filled with shadows that seemed to move just beyond the light's reach. His boots echoed on concrete as he stepped inside. Rats scurried away from the light, their claws skittering across the floor. Jake swept the beam methodically, taking in stacks of moldering cardboard boxes, rusted machinery covered in tarps, and there, in the far corner, a rectangle of newer plywood covered what looked like a doorway. Jake's pulse hammered in his throat as he crossed the warehouse floor. The sweet smell grew stronger with each step, and he had to breathe through his mouth to keep from gagging. The plywood had been nailed over a doorframe, but the wood was warped, and some of the nails had worked loose. Jake holstered his weapon and pulled at the edge of the barrier. It came away with a groan of protesting metal. Beyond lay a narrow hallway that led deeper into the building's bowels. Jake drew his gun again and stepped through. The walls here were different, newer drywall that looked out of place in the industrial setting. Coleman had built something back here, carved out his own private hell. The first door Jake tried was locked, but the wood around the handle was rotted. A solid kick sent it flying open. The flashlight beam revealed a small room with a single chair bolted to the floor and dark stains on the concrete. Jake's throat constricted. He backed out and tried the next door. This one opened onto what looked like an office. A desk sat against one wall, its surface covered with photography equipment, developing trays, enlargers, bottles of chemicals. Red light bulbs hung from the ceiling. On the walls, dozens of photographs were pinned to corkboards. Jake's hands shook as he played the light across the images. Children's faces stared back at him, frozen in moments of terror and confusion. Some he recognized from the storage unit shrine. Others were new, their young eyes pleading silently across the years. And there, in the center of the largest board, was Maria. Jake's knees nearly buckled. His baby sister gazed out from the photograph, her dark hair mussed, her Spider-Man t-shirt torn at the shoulder. But she was alive in this picture, frightened but alive. The timestamp in the corner read 3 days after she disappeared. "Jesus," Jake whispered, his voice cracking. He'd found her. 20 years too late, but he'd found her. A sound from deeper in the hallway froze him mid-breath. Footsteps, slow and deliberate. Jake killed the flashlight and pressed himself against the wall, his heart hammering so loud he was sure whoever was coming would hear it. The footsteps stopped just outside the darkroom door. Jake held his breath, finger tight on his trigger. A beam of light swept through the doorway, playing across the opposite wall. "I know you're in here," a voice called out. Male, older, with a slight rasp. "Jake Rodriguez, isn't it? Steele, they call you." Jake said nothing, trying to pinpoint the man's location from his voice. "You've been very busy," the voice continued. "Breaking into storage units, asking questions. Poor Detective Coleman won't be asking any more questions, will he?" The man chuckled, and the sound raised goosebumps on Jake's arms. "Your sister was special, you know. Such a fighter. Took 3 days to break her spirit completely." The voice was closer now, just outside the door. "Would you like to know what I did to her? How she screamed for her big brother to save her?" White-hot rage exploded behind Jake's eyes. He spun around the doorframe, finger already squeezing the trigger. The muzzle flash lit up the hallway like lightning, revealing a tall figure in a dark coat. But the man was already moving, diving sideways as the bullet sparked off the concrete wall behind him. The abandoned warehouse stood like a rotting tooth against the grey dawn sky, its broken windows catching the first pale light of morning. Jake cut the Harley's engine 2 blocks away, the sudden silence pressing against his ears like a physical weight. His hands trembled as he pulled off his helmet, the cold metal of his pistol reassuring against his ribs. Tommy Briggs had agreed to meet him here, in this industrial graveyard where nobody asked questions and screams got swallowed by the wind. Jake had made the call 3 hours ago, his voice steady despite the rage burning in his chest. 20 years of wandering, 20 years of that gnawing emptiness where his sister should have been, and now he finally had a name. The warehouse door hung open, squealing on rusted hinges as Jake pushed through. His boots echoed in the cavernous space, disturbing pigeons that burst from the rafters in a flutter of wings and panic. Shafts of light cut through the gloom, illuminating puddles of stagnant water and the skeletal remains of old machinery. "You came alone." The voice drifted from the shadows near the back wall. "Smart man." Tommy Briggs stepped into view, smaller than Jake remembered, but still carrying that predatory stillness that had always made people's skin crawl. His hair had gone grey, deep lines carved around his eyes, but the smile was the same, cold and knowing, like he was always in on some joke nobody else understood. "Where is she?" Jake's voice cut through the space between them. "Straight to the point. I always liked that about you Bandidos." Tommy's hands stayed visible, but Jake noticed how he positioned himself near a stack of crates, ready to duck for cover. "Though I gotta say, you look like shit, Steele. This whole crusade ain't been good for your health." Jake pulled the gun, keeping it low but visible. "My sister, what did you do to her?" The laugh that bubbled up from Tommy's throat made Jake's skin crawl. "Still thinking like a biker, aren't you? All black and white, good guys and bad guys. Life ain't that simple, brother. Stop talking in riddles." "I found the storage unit. I know about the others. I know you took them." "Took them?" Tommy shook his head, that sick smile never wavering. "You got it all wrong, Steele. I didn't take anybody. I found them." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. "What the hell does that mean?" "Means I was the cleanup crew, the fixer, the guy who made problems disappear when they got too messy." Tommy reached into his jacket slowly, pulling out a cigarette pack. "Your sister, she wasn't taken by some random sicko. She was killed by someone much closer to home." Jake's finger tightened on the trigger. "You're lying." "Am I? Think about it, Steele. Who had access to her? Who knew her routines? Who could get close without her fighting?" The cigarette dangled from Tommy's lips as he patted his pockets for a lighter. "And who called me to clean up the mess when it all went sideways?" The warehouse seemed to tilt around Jake, the walls pressing closer. "No, you're trying to save your own skin." "Your old man, Steele, Sonny Rodriguez, pillar of the fucking community, came to me crying like a baby, saying it was an accident, saying she fell down the stairs. But I seen what he'd done to her, seen the marks on her neck." Tommy found his lighter, the flame casting dancing shadows across his face. "He paid me good money to make her disappear, make it look like she ran away." Jake's world crumbled, pieces of his life rearranging themselves into a horrible new pattern. His father's drinking after Elena vanished, the way he'd flinched whenever anyone mentioned her name, the violent rages that came more frequently as the years passed. "The other kids," Jake managed, his voice barely a whisper. "Other problems. Other families with secrets they needed buried. I kept souvenirs because, well, call it insurance. You never know when you might need leverage on powerful people." Tommy took a long drag, the smoke curling between them. "But I never hurt them myself. I just cleaned up after the ones who did." Jake raised the gun, his vision blurring with tears and rage. "You buried her. You made us think she left us. Do you know what that did to my mother? I know what your father did to your family, Steele. I just helped him cover it up." The gunshot echoed through the warehouse, pigeons exploding from their perches in a chaos of wings. Tommy crumpled against the crates, clutching his shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers. "Where?" Jake's voice was steady now, cold as winter steel. "Where did you bury my sister?" Tommy looked up at him, pain replacing the smugness in his eyes. You really want to know? Even knowing what it means about your precious daddy? Jake chambered another round. Tell me. The old Chevelle's engine ticked as it cooled in Marcus Chen's driveway, but Jake remained gripped to the steering wheel, staring at the modest ranch house where porch lights cast yellow pools on cracked concrete. 24 hours had passed since he'd left Donovan bleeding in that warehouse, and every muscle in his body screamed with exhaustion. But sleep would have to wait. Too many pieces still floated in the dark, and Marcus held the key to assembling them. The front door opened before Jake reached the steps. Marcus stood silhouetted against the warm glow of his living room. Older now, grey threading through black hair that had once been thick and unruly during those late nights when he'd worked Elena's case with desperate intensity. I wondered when you'd show up, Marcus said, stepping aside. Coffee's fresh. The house smelled of sandalwood and old books. Marcus had always been different from other cops, more thoughtful, less quick to judge a man by his colors. It's why Jake had trusted him back then, and why he'd driven here instead of anywhere else. Donovan's finished, Jake said without preamble, accepting the steaming mug. But not before he gave up everything. Marcus settled into a worn leather chair, studying Jake's face with the careful attention of someone accustomed to reading between lines. How finished? The kind that involves shallow graves and no more questions. Jake's voice carried no regret. Some men deserved whatever darkness found them. He told me about the network. Names, locations, how they moved the kids. Elena was taken to fund their operation, sold to collectors who paid premium for specific requests. The words tasted like poison, but Jake forced them out. Marcus needed to understand the scope of what they'd uncovered, the web that stretched far beyond one sick bastard's obsession. Jesus. Marcus set down his coffee, hands trembling slightly. 20 years, Jake. 20 years I've carried the weight of that case, knowing we missed something crucial. The FBI came in, took over, buried everything under federal jurisdiction. I always suspected there was more to it. There was. Donovan had files on dozens of kids, a whole goddamn catalog. Jake pulled out his phone, scrolling through photos he'd taken before leaving the warehouse. Look at this. Marcus leaned forward, squinting at the screen. Financial records, shipping manifests, correspondence between buyers and sellers, treating children like commodities. The systematic nature of it made Jake's stomach churn even now. This goes back decades, Marcus whispered. Look at these dates. This network has been operating since the 80s, maybe longer. Donovan said Elena fought back, said she was too much trouble, so they... Jake's voice caught. Even now, speaking the truth aloud felt like swallowing glass. They killed her, made an example. Marcus stood abruptly, pacing to the window overlooking his backyard, where a tire swing hung motionless from an old oak. His own kids were grown now, but Jake remembered when they'd been small, vulnerable. Every parent's nightmare made manifest in those storage unit files. The other children, Marcus said. Some of them might still be alive, grown now, but alive. We have to... Already thought of that. Jake's phone buzzed with a text from Rico. A package delivered, friends asking questions. The photos and files were now in the hands of journalists, FBI contacts, anyone who might have the power and influence to act where local law enforcement had failed. Evidence is spreading. Can't bury this anymore. Marcus nodded slowly. You know what this means? For you, I mean. When this breaks, there'll be investigations, questions about how you acquired this information, about what happened to Donovan. Jake had considered that. The club would protect him to a point, but institutional loyalty only stretched so far when federal heat descended. He might face charges, prison time, exile from the only family he'd known since Elena disappeared. The irony wasn't lost on him. Finding justice for his sister might cost him everything he'd built since losing her. Don't matter, he said simply. Some things are bigger than club politics. They sat in comfortable silence, Two men who'd spent decades carrying the same burden, finally understanding the shape of what they'd been fighting. Outside, suburban Riverside slept peacefully, unaware that in this modest living room, the last pieces of a 20-year puzzle had finally clicked into place. Marcus retrieved a bottle of bourbon from his kitchen, pouring 2 glasses. "To Elena," he said, raising his drink. "To all of them," Jake corrected, thinking of the dozens of faces staring out from those photographs, children whose stories were about to be told, whose families might finally learn the truth. The bourbon burned, but it was clean fire, purifying rather than destructive. Tomorrow would bring consequences, investigations, probably arrest warrants. But tonight, for the first time in 20 years, Jake Rodriguez felt something approaching peace. The abandoned warehouse stretched before them like a mouthful of broken teeth, its shattered windows catching the last rays of dying sunlight. Jake killed the Harley's engine and listened to the silence that followed. Too quiet, too empty. Beside him, Marcus dismounted his bike with practiced stealth, his hand already moving toward the Glock, tucked beneath his jacket. "This is it," Jake whispered, checking the address against the scrawled note they'd found in the storage unit. The building squatted on the industrial side of town, surrounded by rusted chain link and dead weeds that had pushed through cracked asphalt like skeletal fingers. They'd spent the last 3 days following breadcrumbs. The phone number in Elena's file had led to a disconnected line, but Marcus had connections that ran deeper than most people's nightmares. A favor called in with a hacker who owed the club money, a few threats made to the right information brokers, and suddenly they had an address that matched utility records from 20 years ago. 20 years. The number sat in Jake's chest like a weight. "You sure about this?" Marcus asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Could be walking into anything in there." Jake's response was to start walking toward the building. He'd been sure about nothing since finding that storage unit, but uncertainty had become his compass. Every step forward felt like stepping through glass, but standing still felt like dying. The front entrance had been chained shut years ago, but the chain hung loose now, cut recently enough that the metal still gleamed silver at the break. Someone had been here. Someone was expecting them. Inside, their footsteps echoed in the cavernous space. Pigeons scattered from the rafters, their wings creating shadows that danced across walls covered in graffiti and water damage. The air tasted of rust and abandonment, but underneath it, something else, the chemical sweetness of things left to rot. Jake Marcus's voice carried a warning. In the center of the warehouse floor, someone had arranged a circle of mismatched chairs. 12 of them, each one different. A kitchen chair, an office chair, a child's wooden seat with cartoon characters painted on the back. In the middle of the circle sat a card table with something dark spread across its surface. Jake approached, despite every instinct screaming at him to run. The dark material was photographs, dozens of them, arranged in a spiral pattern that started at the edges and worked inward. Children's faces smiled up at him from school pictures and family snapshots. Some he recognized from the storage unit shrine, others were new. At the center of the spiral lay a single Polaroid that made his knees nearly buckle. Elena, but not the Elena from his memories or the missing person flyers. This Elena looked older, maybe 16 or 17, standing in front of a brick building he didn't recognize. She wore a yellow dress he'd never seen, and her smile looked forced, painted on like makeup. Written across the bottom in black marker, "She grew up beautiful, didn't she?" Jesus Christ! Marcus had circled around to look over his shoulder. "Is that—" "It's her." Jake's voice came out strangled. "But this picture, she was already gone when she would have been this age." A slow clap echoed from the shadows near the back of the warehouse. Both men spun, weapons drawn, as a figure emerged from behind a stack of shipping pallets. The man looked ordinary, middle-aged, thinning hair, the kind of face you'd forget 5 minutes after seeing it. He might have been anyone's accountant or insurance salesman. "I was wondering when you'd finally make it here," the man said, his voice carrying the casual tone of someone discussing the weather. "Though I admit I expected you sooner. Your sister was always more punctual." "Where is she?" Jake's gun stayed trained on the man's chest, but his hand shook with rage that threatened to overwhelm his training. "Where she's always been. Where they all are." The man gestured toward the photographs with a proprietary air. Safe, cared for, loved in ways their families never could manage. Marcus had moved to flank the man, but Jake noticed there were other shadows shifting in the warehouse's depths. They weren't alone. They'd walked into a trap, but Jake found he didn't care. 20 years of questions were about to get answers, even if those answers killed him. "You're Richard Pemberton," Jake said, pieces clicking together. "The guidance counselor. Retired now, though I prefer to think of it as a career change." Pemberton's smile never wavered. "I've been following your investigation with great interest. You're very thorough, very persistent. Elena always said you'd never give up looking for her." "She's alive." "Oh, yes, very much so. And she's been asking about you." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. After 20 years of grief, of guilt, of imagining the worst, the possibility that Elena was alive felt too large to process. "I want to see her." Pemberton's smile widened. "I was hoping you'd say that." The abandoned textile factory loomed against the storm clouds like a monument to decay. Jake killed the Harley's engine 2 blocks away, his breath visible in the October chill. Every instinct screamed at him to call the cops, but 20 years of mistrust ran deeper than common sense. Besides, if Marcus Kellerman was inside, Jake needed answers before anyone else got involved. The building's windows were either boarded up or shattered, their jagged edges catching what little light filtered through the overcast sky. Jake circled the perimeter, noting the fresh tire tracks in the mud near a loading dock. Someone had been here recently. His phone buzzed. A text from Raina. "I found something else. Call me gay." "Not now." Jake pocketed the phone and approached the loading dock. The metal door hung slightly ajar, just wide enough for a person to slip through. He pulled his .45 from his jacket, checked the chamber, and squeezed inside. The stench hit him immediately, a cocktail of mildew, rust, and something else, something organic and wrong. Jake's eyes adjusted to the gloom, revealing rows of ancient machinery draped in cobwebs. Shafts of grey light slanted down from holes in the roof, illuminating motes of dust that danced like ghosts. His boots echoed despite his efforts to move quietly. The place felt hollow, but Jake had learned not to trust appearances. He moved deeper into the factory floor, past rusted looms and conveyor belts frozen in time. A sound made him freeze. Footsteps, but not his own. They came from somewhere above, the second floor, maybe the old offices. Jake found a staircase, its metal steps spotted with rust and bird droppings. Each step groaned under his weight. The second floor opened into a maze of offices and storage rooms. Most doors hung open, revealing emptiness or the detritus of urban decay. But light flickered from a room at the far end of the corridor, not electric light, something warmer. Candles. Jake's grip tightened on the pistol. The smell was stronger here, that organic wrongness that made his stomach clench. He pressed himself against the wall and edged toward the light. Through the doorway, he saw them. Photographs covered every surface, walls, floors, even hanging from the ceiling on fishing line. Hundreds of them. Children's faces stared out from school pictures, newspaper clippings, missing person flyers. Some photos were recent printouts, others yellowed with age. In the center of it all, a desk held burning candles surrounded by small personal items. A teddy bear, a child's sneaker, a hair ribbon. And there was Sophia's picture, blown up to poster size and mounted on the far wall like an altar centerpiece. Beautiful work, isn't it? Jake spun toward the voice, gun raised. A man emerged from the shadows behind the door. Average height, thinning hair, wearing a cardigan that belonged in a library. Marcus Kellerman looked nothing like the monster Jake had imagined. "You're early," Kellerman said, seeming genuinely pleased. "I wasn't expecting you until tomorrow, but this works out perfectly. Where is she?" Jake's voice came out as a growl. "Which one? I've helped so many over the years." Kellerman gestured at the photographs like a curator showing off his collection. "Oh, you mean Sophia? She's here, of course. She's always been here." Jake's blood turned to ice. "What did you do to her?" "I saved her." Kellerman's eyes held the fervor of a true believer. "Just like I saved all of them. From broken homes, from abuse, from a world that would have destroyed their innocence. They're safe now. They're pure." The smell suddenly made terrible sense. Jake fought the urge to vomit. "You're insane." "I'm a guardian angel." Kellerman moved toward the desk, his hand reaching for something Jake couldn't see. Their parents didn't deserve them. "Your mother, stumbling home drunk while Sophia waited alone in that apartment. I watched for weeks, you know. Saw how scared she was. She wasn't scared of you, though, was she?" Jake kept the gun trained on Kellerman's center mass. "You made her trust you. I showed her kindness, real kindness. She came willingly when I offered her ice cream and promised to take her somewhere safe." Kellerman's hand found what he was looking for, a revolver that looked ancient but well-maintained. Jake tensed, but the man didn't raise it immediately. 20 years I've been waiting for this moment," Kellerman continued. "Waiting for someone to care enough to find me, to understand what I've accomplished here. Most of these children, no one even looked for them properly. But Sophia had you. Where's her body?" "Body?" Kellerman laughed, a sound like glass breaking. "Oh, Jake, you still don't understand. She's not dead. None of them are dead. They're preserved, perfect, eternal." The revolver came up fast, but Jake was faster. His first shot caught Kellerman in the shoulder, spinning him around. The second put him down permanently. In the sudden silence, surrounded by the faces of the lost, Jake finally understood the true scope of the horror he'd uncovered. The warehouse smelled like rust and fear. Jake crouched behind a stack of moldering crates, his Glock steady in his grip as he watched Marcus Delacroix pace near the far wall. The man looked older than his 63 years, his silver hair disheveled and his expensive suit wrinkled from 3 days of running. But his eyes still held that cold calculation that had let him slip through legal nets for decades. "I know you're here, Rodriguez," Delacroix called out, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "The tracker on your bike made it easy enough to follow you." Jake cursed silently. He'd been so focused on getting here before Delacroix could disappear permanently that he'd missed basic precautions. The irony wasn't lost on him. After 20 years of meticulous planning, Delacroix was still 2 steps ahead. 23 children, Jake said, stepping into view but keeping his weapon trained on the older man. "That's what Detective Morrison found in your real files. 23 kids whose cases you buried." Delacroix's laugh was dry as autumn leaves. "You think this is about numbers? About some grand conspiracy?" He shook his head. "You still don't understand what you've stumbled into. Enlighten me." Jake kept his distance, noting the way Delacroix's right hand stayed near his jacket pocket. "Your sister was special, Jake. Not because of who she was, but because of who wanted her." Delacroix's eyes glittered in the dim light filtering through broken windows. Senator Bradley's son had very particular tastes. When he saw Elena at that school fundraiser your mother dragged her to, he decided he had to have her. The words hit Jake like physical blows. "You're lying." "Am I?" Check the photos from that event. October 15th, 1998. Your mother thought she was giving Elena a chance to see how the other half lived. Instead, she put her in the crosshairs of a predator with unlimited resources and a father willing to cover up anything. Jake's grip tightened on his weapon. Bradley's son died in a car accident 2 months after Elena disappeared. Convenient, wasn't it? Delacroix smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Even the senator had limits. When the boy got careless, when he started talking about keeping Elena permanently, Bradley made a choice. Better a dead son than a ruined political dynasty. The implications crashed over Jake like a tide. You helped him clean it up. I was good at making problems disappear. The other children, most of them were just collateral damage. Kids who saw too much or whose disappearances provided convenient cover. But Elena, Delacroix paused, seeming to savor Jake's anguish. She was the beginning of everything. The case that taught me how much powerful people would pay for silence. Where is she buried? Who says she's buried? Jake's blood turned to ice. What does that mean? Delacroix reached into his pocket, and Jake tensed, but the man only pulled out a yellowed photograph. He held it up so Jake could see. A girl with Elena's face, but older, maybe 16 or 17, standing in front of what looked like a boarding school. Switzerland has very discreet institutions for troubled young people, Delacroix said. Places where new identities can be carefully constructed, where a traumatized child can be convinced that her old life was just a nightmare, that her new family saved her from terrible people who would hurt her if she ever tried to go home. Jake's vision blurred. You're saying she's alive? Was. As of 5 years ago, when this was taken, Delacroix lowered the photo. After that, the trail goes cold. Maybe she figured out the truth. Maybe she couldn't live with what was done to her. Or maybe she's somewhere in Europe right now, living under another name, believing her real family abandoned her. The warehouse seemed to spin around Jake. Everything he'd believed, everything he'd been fighting for, shifted like sand beneath his feet. Elena might be alive, might have been alive all these years while he'd been hunting ghosts and planning revenge. Why tell me this? He managed. Because you've destroyed my life, Delacroix said simply. Morrison's already frozen my accounts. The FBI will have warrants by morning. I'm never leaving this country, and I'll probably die in prison. His hand moved back toward his pocket. But I wanted you to know that all your rage, all your need for vengeance, it was wasted. The people who really hurt Elena are beyond your reach. The senator died 3 years ago. His son's been dead for 20 years. And your sister, he shrugged. She might not even remember your name. Jake saw the gun emerging from Delacroix's pocket and reacted on instinct, diving left as the first shot rang out. The bullet sparked off concrete where he'd been standing. He rolled behind another crate, his mind reeling between tactical awareness and the emotional earthquake of what he'd just learned. Elena might be alive. After everything, she might still be out there somewhere. He had to survive this to find out. The abandoned warehouse stretched before them like a concrete tomb, its broken windows staring down at Jake and Detective Martinez as they approached through the pre-dawn darkness. Jake's Harley rumbled to a stop beside Martinez's unmarked sedan, the engine's growl echoing off the empty loading docks. You sure about this intel? Martinez whispered, checking his service weapon one final time. Jake pulled the .45 from his waistband, the weight familiar and reassuring in his hands. Carmen's never been wrong before. If she says Hendricks is here, he's here. 3 days had passed since they'd connected Dr. Richard Hendricks to the storage unit shrine. 3 days of watching his house, tracking his movements, building their case. But Hendricks had vanished yesterday afternoon, leaving behind only an empty office and a receptionist who claimed ignorance about his whereabouts. Then Carmen had called. One of her street contacts had spotted a car matching Hendricks' Mercedes parked behind this warehouse in the industrial district. The same warehouse that public records showed had been purchased 6 months ago by a shell company with ties to Hendricks' practice. There, Martinez pointed to a side entrance where a heavy door stood slightly ajar. Fresh tire tracks in the gravel. They moved toward the building, their footsteps muffled by 20 years of accumulated debris. Jake's heart hammered against his ribs, but his hands remained steady. Every instinct honed by years with the Bandidos told him they were walking into something big. The door opened with barely a whisper. Inside, the warehouse was a maze of shadows and abandoned machinery, but a faint light glowed from somewhere deep within the structure. They followed it, weapons drawn, communicating only through hand signals. The light led them to a converted office space in the warehouse's center. Through grimy windows, they could see movement inside. A tall figure hunched over what appeared to be a desk covered in photographs. Dr. Richard Hendricks looked nothing like the composed professional from his practice headshots. His hair was disheveled, his shirt wrinkled and stained. He muttered to himself as he arranged and rearranged dozens of photographs spread across the makeshift workspace. But it wasn't just the photos that made Jake's blood run cold. The walls were covered with maps, newspaper clippings, and what looked like surveillance photos of children. A calendar marked with red X's hung beside a corkboard displaying driver's licenses, school ID cards, and personal items that could only have come from victims. "Jesus Christ!" Martinez breathed, his voice barely audible. Hendricks's head snapped up at the sound. For a moment, he stared directly at them through the window, his eyes wild and unfocused. Then he lunged for something on the desk. "Move!" Jake shouted, kicking in the office door. They burst into the room as Hendricks grabbed a revolver from beneath a stack of papers. "Stay back!" he screamed, swinging the weapon between them. "You don't understand what you're interfering with!" "Drop the gun, Hendricks!" Martinez commanded, his service weapon trained on the doctor's chest. "It's over!" Jake kept his. Steady, but his eyes swept the room, taking in the full scope of Hendricks' obsession. Photos of children covered every surface. Some looked like school pictures, others appeared to be candid shots, taken without the subject's knowledge. His sister Maria's face stared back at him from multiple angles, including shots that must have been taken just days before her disappearance. "You've been watching them," Jake said, his voice thick with rage. "Stalking them, planning." Hendricks laughed, a broken sound that echoed off the concrete walls. "Planning? You think this is about planning? This is about completion, about finishing what was started. What happened to my sister?" Jake stepped closer, ignoring Martinez's warning gesture. "What did you do to Maria?" "Maria." Hendricks spoke the name like a prayer. Beautiful Maria. She was supposed to be perfect, but she fought too hard. They always fight at first, but Maria, he shook his head sadly. She never stopped fighting. The admission hit Jake like a physical blow. 20 years of wondering, hoping, clinging to the possibility that Maria might still be alive somewhere. It all crumbled in that moment. "Where is she?" Jake's finger tightened on the trigger. "Where's her body?" "The lake," Hendricks whispered. "Pine Lake, where we scattered them all, where they could be together forever, like they were meant to be." Martinez was talking, probably calling for backup or trying to de-escalate, but Jake couldn't hear him over the roaring in his ears. All he could see was Hendricks's face, twisted with sick satisfaction as he confessed to murdering children. "You sick piece of—" Hendricks suddenly swung his revolver toward Martinez. The detective dove sideways as the shot rang out, concrete dust exploding from the wall behind him. Jake didn't hesitate. His .45 barked twice, the muzzle flashes lighting up the room like lightning. Hendricks spun backward, his revolver clattering across the floor as he collapsed among his scattered photographs. In the sudden silence that followed, Jake could hear sirens approaching in the distance. The warehouse echoed with the sound of sirens growing distant as Jake sat on the concrete floor, his back against a steel support beam. Blood from the gash on his forehead had dried, leaving a rusty trail down his face. Detective Morrison crouched beside him, her notepad balanced on her knee. "You sure you don't need an ambulance?" she asked for the third time. Jake shook his head, wincing at the movement. "I'm fine. Just tell me what happens now." Morrison glanced toward the corner where crime scene techs were photographing the makeshift shrine Henley had constructed. Photos of children covered every surface, connected by red string like a madman's conspiracy theory. "We found enough evidence here to put Henley away for life, assuming he survived surgery. The journals alone detail 23 murders spanning 4 states. 23. The number hit Jake like a physical blow. All those families, all those years of not knowing. He thought of his mother, how she'd waited by the phone every night for months after Carmen disappeared, hoping for news that never came. "What about Carmen?" His voice cracked on his sister's name. Morrison's expression softened. "The medical examiner will need to confirm, but based on Henley's writings and the evidence we found, Jake, I think we can finally bring her home." He closed his eyes, feeling 20 years of rage and grief crash over him like a tide. He'd imagined this moment countless times, the closure, the answers, the end of the not knowing, but he'd never expected it to feel so hollow. Carmen was still gone. She'd still been murdered by a monster who'd kept trophies of his crimes like hunting souvenirs. "The storage unit," Jake said suddenly. How did he afford it all these years? Property records show it belonged to his mother until she died in 2018. Then it transferred to him. He's been using it as his personal museum since 1995. Morrison flipped through her notes. "We're coordinating with law enforcement in Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado. There are going to be a lot of cold cases getting reopened." Jake watched the techs carefully bag a small silver bracelet he recognized from Carmen's jewelry box. She'd worn it every day the summer before she disappeared, claimed it made her look older. The sight of it made his chest tight. "I need to call my mother," he said, struggling to his feet. Jake Morrison stood too, her hand on his arm. "Maybe let us handle the notification. We have people trained for this." He shook his head. "She's waited 20 years. It should come from family." The drive back to his apartment passed in a blur. Jake kept thinking about the last conversation he'd had with Carmen, how they argued over her wanting to ride her bike to the corner store alone. He'd called her a baby for being scared of going by herself. She'd called him a jerk and slammed her bedroom door. The next morning, she was gone. His mother answered on the second ring, her voice immediately sharp with worry. "Jake, it's past midnight. Mom." He sat heavily on his couch, staring at the wall where he'd hung the photo of Carmen from the storage unit. "I found her." The silence stretched so long he thought the call had dropped. Then came the sound he'd been dreading. His mother's breath catching, the small sob she tried to muffle. "Is she?" "She's gone, Mom. But we know what happened now. We know who took her." Maria Rodriguez had always been a strong woman, had to be to raise 2 kids alone after their father left. But Jake could hear her breaking apart through the phone, 20 years of hoping finally crashing into reality. "I'll come over," he said. "No, mijo, I need to sit with this tonight, alone. Come tomorrow and we'll talk." After she hung up, Jake sat in the darkness of his apartment. The Brotherhood would be wondering where he'd been, why he'd missed the monthly meeting. His probation officer would want an explanation for why he'd been at a crime scene. Normal life was waiting for him to return to it. But nothing felt normal anymore. Finding the truth hadn't brought the peace he'd expected. Instead, it had opened up a new kind of wound. The certainty that Carmen had suffered, that her last moments had been filled with terror. Sometimes not knowing was a mercy. His phone buzzed with a text from Razor. "Where the hell are you?" Jake stared at the message, then set the phone aside without responding. He'd spent 20 years running from his sister's ghost, throwing himself into the club, into fights, into anything that would drown out the guilt and the questions. Now the questions were answered, but the guilt remained. He'd failed to protect her then, but maybe, just maybe, helping to stop Henley meant some other brother wouldn't have to live with the same burden. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something. A place to start healing from.